Hello. So, hello and welcome to Assessing Student Learning. I am Dr. Addie Tolliver. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Teaching Excellence here at SMU, and very excited to be leading the discussion on assessing student learning. We have a very diverse group of attendees, so it's going to be interesting getting your feedback because some of these, particularly for Brian, I'm not sure this is going to be applicable how you can assess your students for some of the art classes, but for the others, I think this would be a little more applicable. Some of the session goals for today, we're going to be, at the end of the session, participants should be able to differentiate between formative and summative assessments and identify assessment techniques that could be used in their courses. So we're going to have a little hands-on activity there that you can plan a little bit of a summative activity. So a little bit of background in the center. This is our team, and we have our director, Constantine Iclino. He is a senior lecturer in the World Languages and Literatures Department. There's me. There we have two graduate assistants. I want to do that because we have a new person on the team, Valeria, that joined us as a graduate assistant. So I want to showcase that. And we can start talking about assessments. That's what you're here for. If you have any questions, you can send a question through the chat, or you can also unmute yourself. I should be able to hear you, and then you can ask the question out loud. So when you think about assessing students, there's two primary ways of thinking about assessing them. And there's formative assessments and summative assessments. When you think about formative assessments, these are usually low stakes activities, and you check in and see how the students are doing throughout the semester so you can provide them with feedback. And we have summative assessments, which are usually higher stakes assignments that happen after, as a culmination of all the experiences in classes, just to see if the students are meeting the learning outcomes for the goals. So whenever I talk about these two types of assessments, I try to give this colorful analogy of like cooking. And imagine that you guys are in my house and I invited you over for dinner, but you come in a little earlier. And as I'm cooking or drinking wine, you're in the kitchen with me. And I'm saying like, okay, Lai, here, try a little bit of, my soup. And you try a little bit of the soup. And I was like, oh, Addie, it's missing a little bit of salt, a little seasoning. I think you can put a little more salt, a little more pepper, or maybe put, tarragon or whatever seasoning. Oh, okay. So usually, like if you're just trying the recipe that I'm putting together, halfway through the process, you're not going to be as critical of my ability to cook. In fact, you're just going to be helping. You're going to provide me with feedback. I'll put a little more. It's, part of the process. You're not saying, oh, Addie sucks at cooking. That soup tastes like, yuck. Usually you're going to be, okay, she hasn't finished yet. So that should be like how you should see the formative assessment. These are part of the process. So usually they're low stakes. You're not going to say, oh, the student doesn't know anything at all. You're just going to provide them with feedback so they can improve, but you're not assessing the whole quality of their abilities, right? Now, the summative assessment is probably the dinner, right? Like when you're sitting down at a table and everything is set and everybody's sitting down, and I finally bring the finished soup or the finished whatever that I'm cooking, and you put it on the table, and then we're all eating together. Now you're evaluating how good of a cook I am, and you've had opportunities to provide me with feedback where I knew what you wanted, right? Like if you wanted more salt, if you wanted more pepper, I had the ability to put more throughout the process. But now, if I didn't make those changes, you can tell, like, well, maybe she's not that good of a cook, and she did not meet the objectives of the dinner of cooking well. So same thing with the students. So this is at the very end of the class. You've provided opportunities for feedback. You were not as critical, so it was like low stakes feedback opportunity. Here you're sitting down for dinner. Here you're assessing against other dinners that you've been to, like you cooked, you ate at your other friend's house, and how their food tasted. Now you're critical and you're saying, well, Addie can cook or not cook. She has met those objectives or she has not met those objectives. So low stakes, measuring the process, giving feedback throughout the process. Higher stakes, measuring the end result and seeing how the end result, kind of meets the expectation. If I'm telling you that I'm, cooking an apple pie and it doesn't taste like apple pie at the end, you can tell that I have not met those objectives. So, so that's kind of the primary way to think about assessing, is dividing between these two buckets of formative and summative assessments. So the point of it, right? You have to help the students identify their strengths and weaknesses and the areas that they need work. They're novice learners. You know what it takes to be an expert in your discipline. They don't know. So you need to help them get there, and providing lower stakes activities throughout the course, providing them with feedback helps them kind of in the right direction. And you can address problems immediately, and see areas of weaknesses where all students might be having issues, and you kind of reteach some of the topics that the students are struggling with. So it's good for the students and it's good for you as the instructor, because you can provide them with feedback and see where they need more assistance. Now, some examples of formative assessment. One that I really like is the exit ticket. So at the end of the class, you can ask them very briefly to summarize the main point of the lecture before leaving. You can have little note cards that they can put in. It doesn't have to be, for a grade, but you can add a lower grade to this activity. But, they put in the major points that were talked about in class and they turn that into you, and you can kind of skim through all of those submissions and see if they're getting what the point of the lecture is. Also, this kind of reinforces one thing that we know about learning, that it is really important to create a retrieval practice activity. So at the end of the class or immediately after you learn about a topic, forcing yourself to remember what you just heard about. And it's something that it's really, really helpful when we know about learning. So an exit ticket kind of reinforces that retrieval practice activity and that exercise of forcing your brain to retrieve the information that you just heard about, and it helps learning a lot in long-term retention. You can have some in-class activities. So you can have free writes where you give some time for the student to, some intentional time for the student to write about a particular topic. You can have concept maps, quizzes, polling. Any time that they can practice a skill that you're teaching them, that's really helpful. And as they're practicing those skills, you can be walking around the class and monitoring how well they're doing and providing them with feedback. You can be drafting and doing workshops. So if you have any papers or research papers that you do, providing them, drafts where, lower stakes drafts, so you can provide them with feedback, and you can check progress, particularly in the age of AI. Scaffolding assignments and providing the students with that opportunity to submit drafts or work in class to do drafts is good, because you start familiarizing with the student's voice. And if you just say, hey, do this paper, 10 pages, and you never see any part of the process, and they have to submit at the end of the semester, chances are that you might have higher incidences of academic dishonesty, instead of breaking down into smaller parts and maybe do it in class, and you can see the smaller parts being developed. Also for research or project proposals, breaking them down, and you can assess them, with the smaller parts. Now, if you want to think about outside the box a little bit when it comes to formative assessments, you can have self-assessments or reflections. So any metacognitive activity where you're telling the students to think about their own thinking or their own learning is really helpful. So if you are thinking about, teaching in the age of AI in particular, sometimes you might allow the students to use AI for your classes, but maybe it creates some sort of reflection about, the product that the AI is doing, or why did you use AI? What was the prompt that you used, and how was it, was it good to get the answer that you wanted, or is it not? Anything about their own questions they might have or things that were not clear for them. That could be good. Three-way summary. So this is an interesting one. So you can ask them to read something or watch a lecture and then first summarize it like in 100 words, and then you make them smaller, and then you re-summarize them into 50 words, and then you re-summarize them in 20 words. So it requires them to kind of think about that concept and be more concise and concise and concise. But the more they're thinking about it, they're really try to boil it down to the core concepts. Using a polling tool to create a word cloud. So at SMU, we have access to poeverywhere.com, and PoEverywhere allows the students to digitally with either mobile devices or their laptops to submit their responses, and the system will create a word cloud where the words that are said the most are shown bigger into that graphic, and the ones that are show the least are smaller, but then you can visualize the students' comments in a different way. You can do trivia or any type of game, which is fun to do it in class, and you can have creative extension mini projects. So this will be interesting where really you can be allowing the students to be creative in any capacity that they want. They can draw things, they can act out, they can demonstrate their knowledge about the topic in a creative way of their choice. I'm putting here also a URL for a resource that allows you to have there's a list of a bunch of different interactive activities that you can have with your students for face-to-face classes that can be really helpful. There's I don't know, a lot of them, I don't know, 50 or 70 or something. So this also can give you some ideas of some activities to do in class. So particular with formative assessments, a recommendation that I give is to use this methodology called the pause procedure. So if you're going to be in class and you're traditionally lecturing, maybe break down your lecture between 10 to 15 minutes. And after those 10 to 15 minutes, be intentional about stopping the class and creating an activity that the students can interact with one another, and you can use any of these to kind of create some sort of activity that you see how they're progressing if they're getting the information that you're talking about. Then the next one, do you guys have any questions, folks online, or can we move on to the next thing?
The thought that
And you
comes
can unmute yourself if you want to.
Addie,
Hold on, let me see here. Brian, did you start saying something?
I did. I can hear you. Hello?
Oh, hold on. Let me see here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, now I can hear you.
The three-way summaries made me think that, well, I guess part of my interest is to see how, if and how these assessment can be put in service of meeting common curriculum requirements. In my case, it would be to satisfy writing requirements.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. Well, let me put my laptop here. I think that any of these could, but normally they would more of a formative assessment capacity. Usually you're not going to be meeting a UC requirement in 100 words, right? So I think that if you are creative enough, you could make any of these a higher stakes activity. But I would say that it would require a little more effort to be something that will be part of the UC curriculum. You just have to be creative. I think we will have to sit down and think. If you are practicing this in class several times, and it becomes part of an activity that you do all the time for your students, and then maybe you have an activity at the very end that replicates that. And I think it could be done. And if it just become, part of the cadence of the class, you'll have these summaries all the time, and one activity at the end that will be the summative activity. But usually this is done for formative assessment, so you can see how they're doing, provide feedback if they're heading in the right direction, if they know how to do the activity well, And then you can do it at the very end and then assess that last one and as part of the UC curriculum.
One,
Does that
one,
make sense?
one thing I've learned over the past 10 years is that none of these kinds of activities really can be pursued well in a studio course because the class is almost 100% activity for the studio production. So I wouldn't, we're already doing all kinds of activities, and it could be in something like what you have creative extension mini projects, except they're not mini, they're the major projects of the course. But I'm wondering how any kind of assessment tool. So I don't want to stick on the slide or I don't hold you up any further, but my goal is to try to see if I can use any of these things to advance, particularly writing requirements for UC. But a lot of those things are not going to happen in the classroom. The students are not going to be writing in the classroom because they're preoccupied with studio production in the classroom.
I think that it's a yes and, right? So I think that for a studio class, you are creating artifacts. Like, let's talk about ceramics. You are creating the artifact, but you could include some of these activities because the student could reflect on what artifact they're creating. Why are they doing this? Is there any idea behind it? Particularly to be an artist, you would have like an artist. So you could create an artist statement. You could create what is your vision for this particular artwork? What is your inspiration for it? Like if you're using different colors, like why you're picking these colors. So I think that you
again,
do have particular studio art classes, you have the art making that happens, but you could include some of these activities for, some metacognitive activities, like why you decided to use these colors. So think about your own thinking and why you decided to do certain things. And then you can incorporate some of these things
yeah,
as part of their reflection, as part of their assessment.
there isn't
So,
any
yes,
there isn't
and
anything there isn't anything more metacognitive than the creation of the artwork because that's one of the highest order activities. But again, the writing has to do with the strictures that are put in place by the common curriculum, and I not there's only so much room. If you put these on the plate, then you have to remove other items from the plate. And we have multiple assessors. So we have assessors, our most important assessor are the people who assess our studio program. And that's an external assessor, a national assessor outside of SMU. And so, those assessments are the most important assessments, and they're based in studio work. They're not based in small activities, and they're also not based in writing. But we do have some writing requirements, but they're linked, essentially to the CC. So again, they're any kind of alternate metacognitive activity is going to be directed toward how do we satisfy the CC's writing requirements. So I wish there was enough room to say, oh, well, you could do this in addition, but in fact, they already are through the texts that they are reading. They're either academic or popular texts that they're reading. That's what they're doing. But how to kind of satisfy the CC while also maintain the studio project. That's anyway. I won't belabor it, but that's what I'm trying to figure out.
But I think it's a great point that you bring, right? And one of the things that at the CT we can do is sit down with you and really think about like, hey, these are the things that in a semester I have to cover, and those are related to, art making and actually being in the studio and doing the things that we have to do because the accreditor will be assessing this. But in addition to, we need to do the CC. How can we do the CC and make sure that we're meeting all of those accreditation requirements and doing both, right? So because it would be a more targeted brainstorming, we can sit down and talk about it and figure out what makes better sense. But I think that all of these activities could be used just with a little creativity. It all requires is a little creativity. Particularly those with the summaries, normally people would use them as a formative assessment, is just to gauge how people are doing. But I think that any of these activities could be technically used also as summative assessment. It just requires creativity, looking at the overall goals for your class, looking, if you have a UC tag and seeing what that tag is and, how it'll make sense in relation to whatever you're teaching. So but I think that any of them could be used. It's just, it takes creativity. So the next one, right? Summative assessments. So these are the ones that you would traditionally would think of. There are higher stakes, or that's when you're evaluating and really seeing if the student are meeting the learning objectives for the course. Some of the examples are exams, presentations, papers, projects, anything that's like a culminating activity. For all of these, I mean, except for the exams, you can't really scaffold it. I mean, I guess technically you could scaffold exams, but most of the activities, you could scaffold them a little bit and provide them feedback throughout. Then you can also see their progress and see how they're going, kind of see if they're going the right direction. I would not recommend giving presentations, papers, and projects and saying, hey, this is what you do at the end of the semester, and not provide any opportunity for feedback throughout. I would say that even for these, make sure to break them down so that the students have an opportunity to see if they're heading in the right direction. They can ask any questions, you can provide feedback. So some of the examples, like when you're thinking outside the box for summative assessments, podcasts. So this is a new way that you can assess students. Ask them to create a podcast about the topic. You can do a performance. You can do a vlog. So for the students that maybe are not as good in writing, maybe they can create a video log and communication that they can demonstrate to you the things that they have learned in class. You create an e-portfolio. So an e-portfolio would be something that will be interesting even in a studio art class, because they can have multiple artifacts, but maybe they can create a digital e-portfolio with pictures and, descriptions of each of their artworks and the detail the process of how they created these different artworks. And then this is something that you submit at the end of the semester. Zines are interesting because they're digital kind of reading article things, but they can be done by hand. I've seen great examples, particularly one of my graduate assistants, Kendall. She's a PhD student in English. And that's one of the things that she requires from her students, to create these zines. And she gives great examples of zines in the world that people just draw by hand, or it could be typed out, and it could be, little cartoon things, or they can just images or collages. So it can take so many different forms. So they're just, also in using text with the zines to kind of showcase their work and their learning. So they're not as traditional as just exams and, presentations or research papers, but they are great tools for the students to demonstrate what they've learned. And one of the things that we know through universal design for learning, which is like a framework of teaching, basically, is that it's nice to provide different opportunities for students to showcase their knowledge. They might not be in the traditional ways. It might not be just a research paper. Some people might be communicating orally better. So maybe a vlog would be a better tool for them to showcase what they've learned, or doing a performance. Sometimes providing them with a menu of options, the things that they can do, and they can pick what they want to submit as their summative assessment. They can pick, and which is a good student-centered practice. Doesn't happen often, but it's a great student-centered practice, and particularly for, I've seen Mark Cairns from Film and Media Arts. He talked about what is the name of it? Something grading. It's a different way of assessing. So basically, you can allow the students to pick the ways they're going to be assessed, and depending on the level of difficulty of the type of assessment, it might be worth more. And so you can have specifications grading. That's the name of it, specifications grading. So you can say, if you choose to do, a podcast and it's going to be more difficult, it might be worth more points. Or you can do, a couple of vlogs, and that by doing 2 vlogs instead of just 1 podcast is going to be, a certain amount of points. And the students can pick based on how difficult it is. So you can kind of specify and create a menu for them. The other thing is there's this understanding that you can have assessment of, for, and as learning. So if you think about assessment of learning, is that you want to see if the students are achieving things against the outcome, right? So usually those are the summative assessments if you look at the table. And you're seeing if the student is meeting those overall objectives. Now, assessment for learning is more of a formative assessment. It can be the teachers and the peers can do this at the same time. So formative formal assessments. And the goal is to improve learning, but assessment can be used as a learning tool as well. So formative assessment can be learner and peers, and using formal and informal feedback and self-assessment to help understand the next steps of learning. So if you look at this graphic, it's really helpful. The assessment can be used of assessment of learning, assessment as learning, and assessment for learning. And there's a different ways that you can do that here. So we can self-review as part of the learning, and peer review to make a judgment of the work. The students judge their work based on holistic and analytic criteria by comparing examples. They collaborate to develop their own shared assessment criteria, which is very interesting. Can you imagine like the students coming up with the rubric and how they're going to be assessing each other? That'll be interesting. Or for learning, written oral feedback to students, staff-student dialogue, fast forward, action to improve, early feedback to staff to improve teaching. And then here, the assessment of learning, usually higher stakes, right? So seeing if it's for the grade is to see how it's matching with the learning objectives for the class. So we have a little bit of a practice activity. So I want to give you like 5 minutes, and I want you to think about the current learning objectives of the course that you teach, and then imagine a new summative assessment for the course, one that you currently don't make. And then when you design that exam presentation paper project or whatever you are thinking of, why would you choose that? And how would you frame your expectations for that assessment? So I'll give you 5 minutes to think of that. And then I'm going to be asking you to kind of share a little bit, if that's okay. So I'll give you 5 minutes. Go. And if you finish earlier, then let me know, and then I'll unmute and you can share. Time to share. Okay, so let's see. John, I'm going to share what you shared. Likely change your course-long project for systems integration and tests from a provided system type to where the students can choose from at least 3 different system types to develop the test and evaluation plans. This means students could choose a system hopefully they're more familiar with technically, and hopefully better connect the course lesson to their work experience. For this assessment, I had like a chief engineer with each student acting as a test lead engineer. That's wonderful. That is a great strategy. Let's see. Anyone else wants to share a new summative assessment that they would like to integrate potentially?
So next, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. So this is actually building on the workshop I attended, was it yesterday or the day before, around research as well. And one of the presenters then had talked about peer assessment or peer review, which I really like because I like the idea of them learning from each other. I already have that with them doing paired presentations together. But I think this session is inspiring me to think in terms of towards the end of the semester, having them help each other with their the longer paper at the end of the semester, giving feedback, with a very clear rubric. So that's on me to provide a really clear rubric, and so that they could hear from each other as well, and not just from me, and also get a sense of what's possible, because I think sometimes they might get a sense from me that, oh, I'm asking for the moon, but if they can see what other people do, I think it might actually be helpful as well.
So you mentioned like it's on you to provide them with the rubric. Yes and no. one of the activities that you could do too is for them to come up with the rubric. And it's like, if you think of a project, like, what do you think a good project like this would look like? How would you evaluate? How would you say that this is good? And you also can create an activity where they are coming up with a rubric and figure out how they're going to be evaluating each other, which is an interesting way to kind of see this as well.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.
Mhm. How about you, Brian? What
I think
about
that,
new way, a new
I think
summative
that would be really useful to have the students come up with a writing rubric. They've in my couple of my courses, they have to read anywhere from 9 to a dozen articles and describe and analyze them,
Mhm.
but very briefly, all directed towards a writing tag. So they have, I mean, we have, it's more straightforward because we talk about the fabrication projects throughout. That's simpler to, and they tend to be fairly individualized. So they're not all making the same thing, but they are all reading the same article.
Mhm.
So there's individual attention on developing the fabrication. So the idea of having them write the rubric for how to describe and analyze the text, I think I should try to do that.
Mhm.
I don't know about, I mean, initially I might say, well, I could, in terms of your initial question, I could, instead of having them write short essays about the dozen or so articles, to have them integrate all that into a paper. I don't think that works in the studio courses. There's so much activity at the end of like other courses that might say, oh, and like you mentioned, the paper at the end of the term. That's not practical because there's so much studio concentration at the end of a course, so that if there was a big paper, it would have to be a midterm or at some other point in the course. And that's why I try to front load the writing. So we start off, we hit it pretty hard and complete the writing portion as early as possible in the semester. So I'm not sure how I would change it. It's really this. I think it's, yeah, I don't know. And that's one of the reasons I came here was to just see about the course format.
Well, let's work on meeting and sitting down together to kind of brainstorm how this could work, particularly for your class. And I think it would be helpful to see, like, okay, what are the goals for the class? What are the writing goals?
I think it
And
would
then
be, Maddie, and I
we
don't
can
want to
sit
make
down and kind of brainstorm how this activity could go. And if it is, the students creating the rubric, how we're going to build that into the activities they have to do and when it would make sense to do it. I'm happy to do that with you. Okay.
I think it would be, Eddie, but I have to say, a big part of my motive in being here is as a department chair, and I'm much more concerned that I would say that my faculty meet with you than me, especially because because the provost is not, we're not getting positions approved, and we're constantly dealing with visiting faculty.
Mhm.
That they're, some of them are especially would really benefit, I think, from meeting with you
Mhm.
or a variety, all kinds of things in the courses. So I was trying to just get a little sense of your perspective on assessment, so I can try to I have been encouraging people to meet with you, but of course we're just buried with a lot of work, so I don't know that anybody
Yeah.
has.
No, I'm happy to help and just send my name to them, because sometimes, like, there's so many options and it's all about creativity, right? Like, all of these could be used, just have to be creative and look at the overall objectives, making sure that everything in aligns with the overall objectives. Like, what we're trying to get out of this, what do we want the students to be learning or doing at the end of the semester, and how can we make sense of this in the context of the discipline. So I'm happy to sit with anybody one-on-one and kind of brainstorm together and see what makes sense for each
No,
of the disciplines.
I know you're completely willing and able and all that. It's just the other side of things, trying to get out of the studio and
Mhm.
to get over to meet with you is the challenge.
Mhm. Well, the good thing is that I'm staff. So once the classes are over, I'm still here. So if anybody, they could take a couple of days of a break and then we can meet, and
Yeah,
or
that kind of
before the
works
semester
for me.
starts next year.
That
So,
works when,
you know,
that works
I'm
when people have
available. We can
long-term,
meet
that
in
works
Zoom
when
too.
that works when people have long-term contracts, and that's the challenge is we're only allowed these short-term contracts. And
Mhm.
so it's hard to incentivize people to take time that they're not being paid for to come do these things.
I understand. Okay, so one thing that I also want to highlight is to check with the department, right? Like if some departments might have some expectations of how the assessments should be for the department. So in some accreditors have some expectations of what the assessments should be. So make sure to check what those are. And then just to finish our session, we can finish a few minutes earlier. I wanted to just double check with you guys and see if you're clear about what formative assessment is and summative assessment. So if you could use the chat and share with me your own definition of formative and summative assessment. And then I'll give you, 1 minute to do so. So just a little summary, and I can use my analogy again. Formative assessment is just testing the food as you are cooking it. So you're not going to be critical about it. You're going to just provide feedback,